Hello, hello. Okay. So why don't we kick things off, Sahar, and start our conversation. Thank you to everybody who is participating both through our Zoom platform and live on Facebook from our Startup Canada communities across Canada and from our entrepreneurship cohort from coast to coast to coast. My name is Kayla Isabel and I'm the Executive Director here at Startup Canada based in Ottawa. We are really delighted to present Sahar Ansary, the co-founder and product lead at Fundica and a partner at the Montreal Technology Consultancy, R&D Partners, who really specializes in advising high-growth tech companies to assess eligibility for and aid in obtaining funding. So, you know, from our community at the moment, we're hearing very loud and clear that funding, especially during a COVID-19 sort of situation, has been a challenge, especially for different types of entrepreneurs, especially those who are potentially more on the solopreneur side, pre-revenue, or looking at, different models of funding that aren't necessarily being qualified for the government funding allocation. So really excited to dive into today's conversation to understand the 5 W's of funding and understand how we can use this platform of Fondica to identify funding opportunities and access those funds ASAP, because as we can appreciate right now is a very challenging time for everybody. So I think this conversation is incredibly timely. And thank you, Sahar, for joining us today. So maybe we'll kick things off with a bit of an introduction of where things started for you, how Fondica began, and diving into today's presentation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kayla, and thank you, Startup Canada, for having me. It's nice to be able to connect with everybody through the web and through different ways. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here. So thank you again for organizing. So as Kayla said, today we're gonna go through the presentation on the W's of funding. So to start off a little bit on me. Yes, okay. As Kayla already introed me to a certain extent, so kind of co-founder of Fundica, as well as working as a partner at R&D Partners. Maybe a little bit of history on how this all came about in terms of Fundica. What really, with R&D Partners, so we're a consulting firm based in Montreal that work across Canada. We work with technology companies that are looking to leverage government funding. So we work primarily in the government grants and tax credit space, so the non-dilutive funding space. And some of the programs that many people know and use often are the large tax credits. So the R&D tax credit, there's multimedia for the gaming industry and other ones. And through that business in the consulting work, many people were asking us, you know, what other grants and what other programs are available to us that we could also leverage. So we were hearing a lot about that and a lot of that from our clients. And so we started to, you know, put together these lists for different clients that were either a small, as I was saying, ag tech in BC to a large software company in Montreal. And these lists of programs just started to grow, and it became difficult to, you know, sort through depending on the industry, the size, the location, the needs of the company. And so as this database in Excel started to really grow, we decided to make it maybe more intelligent to search through and identify the relevant programs for different clients. And so this intelligence came through the development of a search engine to identify those sources. And once we developed that as an internal tool, we decided to put it, you know, and make it available to others, which is how Fundica was born. So really the core of Fundica is the search engine for funding in Canada. So it's primarily focused on the Canadian network, but across provinces. And so it allows entrepreneurs from tech or non-tech, small to large, to really go through and search for funding and identify. So it's an identification tool with additional information. So we'll go through kind of how it works and what it looks like a little bit later in the presentation. But in terms of, yeah, so the business, R&D Partners has been in business for over 15 years, really working on the leveraging government funding for technology companies. And then Fundica is an online platform that allows for the identification of funding for companies across Canada. In terms of the presentation, so today what we're going to do, so 5 W's. So what, who, why, where, how. So we're going to go through those. So really kind of the overview on the funding landscape in Canada to give the basics. And then we'll go into the how does Fundica work, which is a little bit of the where you can find some funding, as well as into some of the specifics of different programs available. So tax credits, grants, and then some of the very specific COVID programs that I know a lot of people have been hearing about that we can also chat about.
Fantastic. And then in terms of our audience, so you're welcome to use the chat function to sort of share comments or anything that you would like. If you do have questions that you'd like that are specific to different slides, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask a question, and then we'll sort of be taking them throughout the session, and we'll have some dedicated time at the end as well. So we welcome all of that feedback and all those questions that we'll hopefully be able to get to with these different program components. So you dive right in, Sahar.
Yes, feel free to ask questions as we go through this. So if we talk about the what, so the funding types. So there's different types of funding, and often we hear these keywords, but not necessarily kind of fully understand how the mechanics of it all work. So if we look at we start kind of from the top here. So tax credit. So what we're talking about here too is the timing of funding, which becomes quite important for these different programs. So when we say timing of funding, it's either when you should apply for the funding and or when you would expect to receive the funding. So when we're talking about tax credits, what are tax credits? They're really government tax credits that are offered to companies. The way the timing of funding works, it's typically you will incur the expenses throughout the year. So your fiscal year as a company, so you'll pay salaries, you'll buy materials, and then at the end of the fiscal year, you'll look back on those expenses and apply for a tax credit on the expenses that you incurred. So it'll always be after the fact. And you'll be looking to recapture on those expenses. So that's how a tax credit works. An example is the R&D tax credit, which is one of the largest tax credits in Canada for research and development that allows you to go recapture costs spent on expenses on salaries and materials and other related to R&D. When we're talking about a grant, really this one you have to apply for before you start incurring the expenses. So often what will happen is that you'll say, okay, I want to hire somebody, or I'm going to undertake a project that will cost me X amount. And so you will look to apply for the grant, ideally receive acceptance to the grant, and then begin incurring the expense. So it's very different in terms of timing of how these work when we're looking at tax credits versus grants. The other thing with grants is there'll be situations where you'll receive the funding as a lump sum at the start once it's accepted, or you'll receive it throughout the period once you've been accepted. So you'll do monthly claims, or you'll do, depending on how it's structured, you'll receive funding throughout the period. So both kind of coming from government. Tax credits, really you incur the expense, then you apply. Grants, really important that you apply for it before. And this, we see it very often. We'll meet with people and they'll say, I just hired someone and they would have fit into this program. I wish I had seen that before. But unfortunately, once they've been hired, once they've started paying their salary, we can no longer go back and look to apply for the grant. So this is kind of an important difference between these two. When we're talking about loans, so with loans similar to grants, you're always going to be applying before you begin incurring the expense. So again, you're kind of projecting and forecasting, what are my expenses going to be? Where do I need support in terms of cash flow, in terms of other injections of money? And so you'll be applying for it before. Often people are familiar with loans just through personal loans as well. So it's kind of the same deal, right? Loan guarantees. So this is one that often people are less familiar with. So loan guarantees, the way they work is that they go together with a loan, either a private loan, which is through a bank, or a public loan, which would be through the government. And what it does, it allows you to come and guarantee the loan in the event of failure or bankruptcy or other situations where it cannot be paid back. And so typically there'll be a percentage of the loan that will be covered. Often we'll see around the 75% loan guarantees, meaning that in the event of default, 75% of the loan will be guaranteed. Often these guarantees are provided by the government, and so you won't have to pay back that 75%, but you're still liable for the 25%. So that's how a loan guarantee would work. We have an example here, which is Canada's Small Business Financing Program, which is available for guaranteeing loans against equipment and capital and other expenses, the like. Often during acquisitions, this can be an interesting one when there's a lot of capital expenditures. Equity, so this is really kind of venture capital investments. This is really the timing of this. The way we look at it is when you find that product market fit, right? So once that's been established, it's not really before or after, but it's when you need that injection to take it to the next level. You've determined the product market fit, and now you want to go the next step. So that would be for venture capital. And then there are a number of other sources of funding as well. It's kind of exploded in the space of different varieties and hybrid ones. And so you'll find some people looking into ICOs and crowdfunding and different innovative ways to search for funding. But the ones above are kind of the traditional, I would say, funding types. So that's kind of the what. If we go into the who provides the funding and the why. So again, with these same categories a bit broken down, this allows you to kind of better understand what is the motivation and the considerations and what are they looking for when you're applying for and obtaining these different funding types. So if we look at tax credits are really defined in the law. It's provided by the government. So the motivations are typically predefined by the government. There is no expected return or expected revenue typically tied to the obtaining the tax credits and specific business model, but really what it is do you fit the criteria that is outlined in the law? So with tax credits, the way it works too is that if you do meet the criteria, you kind of have the right to obtain that tax credit, which is not so the case with grants, where it's much more competitive, where the criteria is much more subjective and depending on the availability of funding, right? Whereas the tax credits, it's in the law. If you meet the criteria, the funding should be allocated to you. With grants, if we look at it, financial motivation, so societal, again, there'll be different initiatives depending on the climate that we're in. So right now we're seeing quite a few around the COVID to relieve some of the issues around that. In the past or recently, we've seen a number of grants around for women entrepreneurship. Others will be around hiring and creating jobs in the tech space. So it'll really be different focuses that we'll see for grants, but typically there's no return expected by the government once they provide the grant. There is no expected revenue. What they're looking for is really that you have a reasonable business plan and that you are the best in line based on the motivation of the grant that's being provided. Then we go into loans. So loans, we've broken it out into public and private. So again, public being government loans. So there are some available through the government that will either be lower interest here or sometimes now they've been announcing some interest-free loans too, which is interesting. Again, with the government loans, it'll be societal motivation. So different initiatives based on the climate. If we compare public and private, so with the private loan, they're really looking for a return on the investment, right? When you go to a bank, they're looking for, interest and a return on the lending that they're doing. The rates will be a little bit different. They're still, public loans still bear typically interest, except for a few, but they'll be lower. And the expected revenue for them will be, for private loans, typically around 30,000. They want to see some cash flow within the company. They'll be stricter on that, and they want to see that it can be secured, that you have a good financial modeling and stability within the company. Whereas with the public loans, they're looking for reasonability. They're looking at it as a whole. How are you going to bring that impact to society? They're looking at it from that side. On the private loan, they're looking really more at what are your assets? What's your cash flow, and how able are you to actually pay back these loans that you're taking, right? So kind of the typical way. When we think about angel investors, so again, their kind of motivation is a return on their investment. They're looking at returns of over 20% typically. And when we compare venture capital to angel investors, we're looking at revenues below the $100 million mark. And really the business model that we're looking at is with angel investors, they got to believe in it, right? They kind of meet you, they like you, they like your team, they like your idea, and they believe in it, and they're ready to put in some of their money in order to help you grow. So that's where an angel investor is motivated and comes in. Venture capital is really more, we're looking at higher expected return, higher in terms of revenues that you're expecting, and they want to see traction, right? For them, it's much more strategic. It's much more the idea of being able to achieve that expected return is what motivates their investments. There's a little bit of believe in it, obviously, depending on who you're working with, but you know, it is much more analytical in that, and they want to see an exit. So when we're working with venture capitalists, they're kind of looking at it as how long before I can get that return that I'm seeking with the investment that I'm making. So this is kind of the who and the why. Feel free to ask any questions if there's anything that you're wondering about. When we look at the how, so how to get funded. So this is kind of like our little infographic series of questions that we think is the logical flow in terms of what type of funding to look for when, and then how to go about it. So if we kind of follow the arrows here, we've got the start. So you start out and you start thinking about, you know, what is my product? What is the market? Do I have that product market fit? If no, then you probably shouldn't continue on to the funding search. That's probably the first most important aspect to consider and to establish. So that's kind of the core. The next thing is, do you have that core team that can support the development of this product market fit, that can help develop the product and really has the knowledge base. Sometimes if you're one, maybe you need to complement with, you know, if you're the technical lead, you need to complement with the business side. There'll be different aspects that could come from a good core team. So that's kind of the second step. So again, yes, no. If you don't, you go to build a team. If you do, now you have your product market fit, you have your core team. This is when you're kind of looking into, okay, do I have any cash in hand? So is there any money that I have now to build either, you know, my website, my product, my prototypes? Usually what we would recommend is you first go and seek some cash injection from love money, from bootstrapping, you know, kind of get the engine rolling here. Start with something small, start with something that you have, that you can show, right? That you can then go to the next steps of either government, private, or other, with some cash in hand that you could build, maybe, like I was saying, a first prototype, a demo, something that you could then leverage and use towards your business plan. So once you kind of have that, the next and the first step in this kind of real funding search journey, and the way we would see it, is the low-hanging fruit, which is government funding. So the nice thing about government funding is obviously it's non-dilutive and it's non-repayable, right? So one, you're not diluting yourself, meaning you're not giving away your shares to the company, so you're maintaining ownership. And two, if it's a grant or a tax credit, these are incentives that are, and money that is injected into the company that you don't have to repay or think about how you're going to repay. So often there'll be different programs, whether we're talking about here tax credits or grants. And there'll be different focuses for tax credit. Maybe I'll just go to the next slide and we can come back. But in terms of grants and tax credits, the focus often that we'll see in terms of the areas of funding that the government will focus on will be these four. So first one being on workforce. So are you looking to hire or train your employees? So hiring meaning full-time employees or internships. There's quite a bit of funding, especially in terms of grants, around hiring either specialized personnel or new graduates in order for them to gain experience, as well as in terms of interns. So to come in and help you, whether it be on the administrative side, on the technical side. But this is kind of a big area of funding for the government. And then training as well, and we're seeing different training initiatives coming out now too with the COVID situation, you know, saying if you're not able to work as many hours, or if you're not able to work at all, there are some employee programs and employer programs that can allow you to maybe train the workforce while during this situation. The other pocket would be product development, research and development. So this is really where Canada is trying to elevate the technology level of Canada, and so really inject in innovation. And so research and development, either there'll be the tax credit programs, there'll be grants for taking the risk to innovate, as well as to work with universities, with CEGEPs, with other organizations in order to advance science faster and with less risk. And often these will come as subsidies towards, again, expenses such as salaries, materials, and the such. The next pocket we usually see is around marketing and export. So once you've established the product market fit, you've started to start with some sales, many programs will be available, or there'll be a pocket of programs available for exporting. So either going out of province, or provincial programs that will allow you to go and market your product and your services outside of the province, or even outside of Canada. So there are subsidies that will allow for travel to meet with, you know, strategic partners, that will allow you to develop marketing materials, that will also allow you to go to conferences or seminars in order to distribute the information on the company and the products. So that's another pocket. And the final pocket that we'll see is around capital expenditures. So when you need to inject cash to buy equipment, if it's in a manufacturing situation, if it is in either expansion, so if you need more space, offices, buildings, or even just for testing. So sometimes, you know, you can test it small scale, but now if you need to go to a larger scale, you need to invest in capital to do so. And so these are probably the 4 areas that we'll see the most government funding available. Obviously, there's things outside of this, but this is to keep in mind as well when you're applying for funding, as these are the areas that clearly, from a societal perspective, are being pushed forward in terms of areas that are the government is favoring for incentives. And so when you're applying for the different grants, it's interesting to maybe showcase, you know, I'm looking to invest in my workforce, I'm to develop my product, and then to expand and go outside. And so these are obviously areas that they're interested in injecting funds into.
So we have a question for you, Sahar, from Anuja. Is funding available to independent or freelance consultants? What would that look like from a grant and tax credit funding perspective, or maybe some of the other elements?
Right, sure. So obviously every program has a little bit of its own criteria. Often I would say the larger pockets of money will be for incorporated companies. So as a freelance consultant, if you have an incorporation, that will open you up to more funding available. So that's kind of an important thing to consider when you're looking for funding. But definitely there will be programs that will be available either in the startup phase, so when you're trying to establish the consulting business, or maybe when you're looking to expand or go beyond, you know, your current client base. So those would be where you'll find the pockets of funding, I would say.
Right, thank you.
If we go back to kind of continue on this path here, so we kind of did the government funding. So again, we looked at the idea would be, you know, you look at what you have in terms of cash in hand, and then you apply for government funding. The one thing to know, and often people maybe forget, is that government funding will always come and cover a percentage of the expenses that you're going to incur in your project. So a percentage of the salary, a percentage of the expense, but it will never cover 100%. So you always need to have a little bit of cash in hand to be able to put towards the complementary to whatever the government is going to invest. As well, the government wants to know that, you know, you have some skin in the game, that you're also willing to invest in your business, in your products. And so that shows them that you believe in it as well. And so that they'll come in and support it further. So that's why this kind of flow makes sense. And that's also an important consideration, is that government funding, and I will say it never will cover 100%. You know, the max we'll often see is around 80%, but there's always a little bit of a 20, 25% that does need to come from the company. But again, 70, 80% is wonderful to be able to take that cash that you do have in hand and take it further. Once you've kind of looked at those, the next step is perhaps to look into, if you do need, you know, cash flow or additional funding, to look into bank loans. So whether, well, here we talk about bank loans, but they could also be government loans. But really, elements that are non-dilutive here is what we're kind of focusing on. So looking at how far you can take this with your own cash, with the government funding, and then with a little bit of injection into your cash flow. This will only obviously be available if you're able, when you go to a bank, it's often they'll be looking at your cash flow history, at your assets. So what can you put towards securing these loans? So those will be important factors. If you're able to do that, this is an interesting option to look at next. And then finally, and again, if you look at it, it's kind of the last step in here, is to go and look into angels and VCs. So really equity funding, which would, yes, dilute, but again, allow you to achieve that growth perhaps that you're looking for. And with an angel, sometimes as well with VCs, you'll allow to maybe bring on advisors, mentors that could also help along the way. I see a question here.
Yeah, we've got another question. Which major features do banks and organizations look for in a team to provide funds and invest in a certain company from a bank organization perspective?
Right, so with banks, what they're looking at is really the cash flow and the assets, but ultimately it is secured by the people that are on the team. So the financial stability of the individuals on the team will be definitely a factor. If there are people or one person in the team that maybe has less, you know, the history is a little bit more difficult or whatnot, then it's nice to have it complemented by somebody else. And depending, these are always case by case, but they will be looking at the individual's history in terms of financial records and other things like that. So that's probably what they're looking at from a bank perspective.
Great. Then from Facebook, so we have people participating live on Facebook as well. Is this journey map the only way forward, or are there other paths?
Oh, there are definitely other paths. This is kind of our, you know, simplified, recommended approach, but definitely there are multiple different paths. It's just that this is one of the ways that we think you can leverage, one, the cash that you have in hand to go further with it, as well as allow you to maintain ownership for as long as possible, grow it, in order to then go get investments from angels and VCs at moments where it's really the most, you know, valuable to you, so that you can go to that true growth stage that you're looking for, and likely dilute less, right? The earlier you go in, the more diluted you'll end up coming out. The later, likely the dilution level will be lower. So this is kind of with that in mind.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so we did this slide, so I just flipped over it. Now, if we talk about the where, so where is kind of where Fundica comes into play. So now that you know, okay, we have all these different sources of funding, kind of understand what they're looking for. Now it's, where can I identify these, right? And so what we've developed at Fundica is really a search engine, as I was saying earlier, that brings in, you know, kind of scrapes the internet for the different sources of funding. We have a team of dedicated researchers that maintain the database. So as you might imagine, these programs change all the time. There's new announcements, as we're seeing now, daily. But that's always somewhat been the case with different budgets, with different initiatives coming out to fund different things. So this is a way for us to maintain a comprehensive database of the programs available, and then allow entrepreneurs in different industries, different locations, to find which ones really apply to them. So I'll kind of show you the way it works with respect to Fundica. So these are just screenshots, but if you want to go and try it, it goes pretty fast. You go to fundica.com, and this is the flow that you would see. So what you would see is you come in fundica.com, and the first thing would be to put in some information on the company. And so the main or the key elements in order to enable this really intelligent filtering are these questions on the company. So they're pretty high level, so you shouldn't feel like you're giving away too much on the company, but the idea is zip code. So in order for us to know where you're based, the year of incorporation to understand, the level. So has it been a year? Has it been 10? The industry, so you can actually select up to 3 industries. So sometimes there's companies that are in between. If you're like agriculture and software, you would put both of those. Number of full-time employees and revenues in the last year. So these are kind of the 5 key elements that we ask up front, and then you put in your email and password and you create your account. There are no fees, it's completely open and free, but this allows to create kind of a preliminary profile on the company and do a preliminary search. Then you go into, when you go in, you'll see right away an initial list of programs. So this is kind of the view that you'll see, which depending on the information that you provided will be different, but it'll really list, the federal, the provincial, the local, really based on your zip code programs. And it is segmented into, if you're looking here, I don't know, can you see my mouse? No. Here? No? Okay. Okay, so you'll see is kind of first tab is favorites. So as you go through it, you can favorite some different programs. Then you see at the top there, this is a French screenshot, but it says subvention, so grants. There's 11 grants that have been identified for this particular profile. Then tax credits, loans, loan guarantees, equity, and then we also have a tab for accelerator programs and contests. So as those come along, that might be relevant to your industry, your size, your type of company, as well as some advisors. So some advisors have come on and offering different services and different advisory services that they're willing to give to different companies of different sizes and industries. So this allows you to navigate and kind of narrow down instead of going to multiple different websites, different often government websites at different levels or different resources. It kind of congregates it all into this one page that you can then navigate, review, and then favorite, right? So if there's a top 3 that you would then favorite and come back to. What we typically recommend is going through it. There's also secondary filters, which we haven't shown here, that are in the top right corner. You can actually select, and then you can say, what are you interested? Are you interested in hiring? Are you interested in buying equipment? Are you interested, are you doing research and development? And that will further narrow it down. So that's also an interesting next step. It actually narrows and adds. So it's an important next step, I would say, and allows it to really tailor the programs. Once you if there is a program that you're interested in, you can actually directly click on it and it'll go into and open a full page description on it. So here you're seeing, the My Tax Accelerate program. There'll be a description of the program, the max funding available, what it will cover in terms of expenses, and some contact information, as well as the website, guidelines, application forms if they're available. So it's kind of a summary here, although we do provide the link to go directly onto the website of the funder in order to see that information. If you see at a preliminary, it's interesting, you click on the heart, it's favorited, you can come back. The idea is never to apply to 50 grants or 50 programs. It's to identify the top 5 that make sense for you now. And as we were saying earlier, with grants, you want to be searching and identifying before you incur the expense, right? So this is almost like a forecasting tool as well, to say, okay, maybe I'm not looking, to hire a PhD right now, but in 6 months from now, my project will need that. And so I can actually filter here and say hiring master's, PhD level, and it'll find a program such as the MyTax program that would fit for that, which I might not use now, but the moment that I'm ready, I would come back and it's in there and I know I can apply for it. Otherwise, on the tax credit side, there might be programs that you're already incurring expenses for that makes sense, that you should be, forecasting into your financials as well, into, this is a return that I'll be able to get at the end of the year. And when you're going to banks, when you're going to investors, this will be something that they'll value, and they'll see, that you're doing your homework to see how you can leverage your money and eventually their money to take that further. So how will you be able to take that further? Exactly. So yeah, go ahead.
A question from the audience. So does this also include funding from professional associations and foundations? Would that be a part of this research exercise that gets loaded into Fundica?
Right, so what we have in here, if they are for businesses, they will be included. So it'll be government as well as, private and foundations and others. So sometimes there'll be, grants and contests from foundations that we will also include, as long as they're targeted towards businesses in Canada. So that's kind of the focus.
Right, wonderful. And then what if you're not incorporated? How should you be approaching the platform if you haven't reached that step yet?
Right, so that's actually a question I got this morning from somebody. What I would say is, if you're planning to incorporate, put in the current year. So what we ask for is the year of incorporation. And so you can put in 2020 as, the year of incorporation. So that way it's able to show that these would be programs that'll be available for new companies, so that have been in business for, often the criteria that we're looking to filter on is that many programs will be for businesses that are either in business for less than 2 years or over 2 years or less than 6 months. And so that's the elements that we're filtering on to show you the programs that are relevant. Makes sense? Anything else? No? Okay. So that's really Fundica. And again, I recommend you kind of go in, you can create an account. As I said, it's completely free. If you have any feedback, I'm happy to hear that as well. And if there's, so I think this is kind of a great resource for everybody to do for forecasting, for identifying, and then for applying. If we now go into some of the programs that are available. So just kind of quickly at a high level, and if you have any questions on any specific ones, I'm happy to answer those as well. But some of the larger, more well-known programs, the ones that are going to touch on in terms of tax credits, and then some specific ones for grants, and then the COVID program. So tax credits, one of the larger incentives that I mentioned earlier, so the R&D tax credit. So this one is a tax credit for businesses in Canada. There's a federal program as well as provincial programs across the country, which allow you to go get up to, in Quebec being the most favorable combined rate of 74% return on salary expenses that were towards, R&D efforts. The way this program works, so again, it's a tax credit, so you apply for it at the end of the fiscal year. What they're looking for in terms of criteria is that there was a project that meets 3 criteria. First criteria is that you're looking to advance technology and science, so you're advancing compared to the state of the art being what's available, what's known, as well as what's internally the knowledge base within the company. So the knowledge base within, a company like, let's say, Google would be very different from a small startup, in the same space. So you're comparing to the internal as well. So that's the first criteria. Second criteria is that there is technological uncertainty with respect to the objectives of advancement that you've set. So there's a level of risk in the project. So you're looking to advance technology, achieve a certain performance, but there is unknown as to how you're going to achieve that. And the best way to show that is through iteration. So you'll have a first hypothesis of, okay, I believe that I can achieve this with this type of a prototype. I'll test it, I'll design it, I'll test it, I'll review the conclusions, and then I'll go back and iterate. So it's an experimental project where there's risk involved. And the third criteria would be that there's a systematic approach, so that it's not ad hoc, trial and error. You're not just putting things together, but you're using a scientific method that is documented and that you can reflect back on later and that you learn from. So those are kind of the main criteria. It's looked at on a project basis. It's not based on the company. It's really based on the project. So some companies will have one large or small project within the company, and others will have, you know, dozens of projects, depending on, you know, if they're multinational across the country, they'll have different projects in different divisions. This program is available to small companies, you know, as well as very, very large companies. The rates will change and be different if you're Canadian controlled small company versus a large international company, foreign controlled in Canada. The most favorable rates being for small CCPCs, so Canadian controlled private companies. The second program here, so that first one was federal and across provinces. Second one, that's an interesting one, is a Quebec program. So this one is a program, a tax credit for software companies that are developing B2B software solutions that helps improve business processes at their client location. So think of an ERP system that's being developed. Think of, you know, all these different B2B softwares that are now helping businesses improve their productivity, efficiency. This is a tax credit that applies to salaries. So you're able to go get up to $25,000 per employee against salaries in the year. So it's quite interesting as well. And this one is only available in Quebec. There is no comparable program in any other province. Yes, multimedia tax credit. So this one is also available in Quebec, Ontario, and BC. It's really the reason why we see the gaming industry in Canada and what they're come here to take advantage of. The rates will differ, will be different across provinces, but it's really a tax credit towards the salaries of employees or contractors that are working on interactive multimedia titles, meaning that it can be games, but it can also be e-learning, any type of solutions that are highly interactive. When you think of it almost like in a gaming fashion, would fit under these programs. And lastly, there's quite a bit of different tax credits in different provinces, again, that are towards the hiring of co-op students. So students that are in a recognized co-op program can benefit from, often there'll be grants towards hiring them, as well as this tax credit, and you can actually use both. There's a interesting calculation to do the stacking of it, but you can benefit from both a grant and a tax credit when hiring co-op students. So this is, as I was saying, towards that workforce and training of bringing in. So good to know when you have also the option between a non-co-op and a co-op student, if you know that you're able to benefit from a tax credit as well by hiring a co-op student. So these are some of the kind of well-known, larger, well-used tax credit programs that could be available to businesses. If we look at the grants, so here we've selected a few. Obviously, I suggest going on Fundica because there is a wide range of these, but if I were to highlight a few, the IRAP program, so this is a grant that can cover up to 80% of expenses, up to $1 million on projects that are research and development. So very similar to that SR&ED tax credit we were talking about earlier, but this one is a grant, so it's something that you would apply for before you undertake the expenses. So it's more interesting for companies that are looking for help with the cash flow. So you apply, you get accepted, and then on a monthly basis, you would claim towards the expenses that you incurred in that month instead of having to wait until the end of the year. Both programs can be used together. What happens is you can't double dip. So the SR&ED tax credit will be reduced by the amount of IRAP that you did receive. So obviously you won't get a tax credit on the grant money, but you'll get it on the portion that you had to still pay towards the salaries and expenses of the project. In terms of Grant Plus, so this is a grant available in Montreal. So I have one in Montreal, one in Toronto that are quite similar here. The Montreal one, both are for startup. So really towards working capital and cash flow at the startup stage. For the Montreal one, it goes up to $30,000. The Toronto one up to $5,000. Toronto one being focused on women founders, which is an interesting one as well. but both programs are grant programs that are available in the first year or two when you're starting up the company. And they have different criteria, and they each have different application deadlines. So these programs are rolling. They continue to be available, but they close off applications, assess, distribute the funds, and then reopen for the next round. So they're always available, just on a rolling basis. My tax program, which we kind of saw a little bit earlier, also another one that's tech focused. So really for hiring PhDs and master students that would come in for internships of 4 months. This is a federal program, so it's available across the country. It works quite well. So it's a cost sharing between my tax and the company. So 50% is covered by my tax and 50% by the company, up to $7,500. So the way it works is it'll be $15,000 for 4 months. $7,500 is paid by the company, and $7,500 by my tax, which goes towards the master's or PhD level students' income during that period. You can actually use multiple blocks, and you can plan for multiple blocks. So when we say blocks, these are 4-month blocks, but you could say I want someone for a year, and so you would put together 3 blocks at a time. Great thing about my tax too is they really work with you, and so they're able to identify as well people that could fit well into your projects if you have a project that you need help with. So put you together with a professor or a student. Any questions? No? Okay. How much time do we have? Okay, we're good. Yeah. Okay, so now the next slide here, really on the COVID funding program. So I know you've probably been hearing a little bit about this throughout the last webinars and on a daily basis, right? We're all kind of watching the news pretty closely. I'm going to talk about a few of the federal larger incentives that are available to different companies. So if we start with the first one, so the work sharing program, this is a program that's existed for quite a while, so it's been available. What's happened is that they've opened it up in terms of and loosened it a bit in order to help with the COVID relief. So what is the work sharing program? Really what it allows for is if the employees at the company are going to be working at a reduced level, so reduced by at least 10 to 60%. This allows you to avoid having to lay them off. So you're able to keep them working at the reduced level and then complement their salary through the work sharing program, which actually goes through the EI program, in order to keep them on and allow them to maintain, their salary level through that period. Typically, it's a program that goes up to 38 weeks. They've now extended it to 76 weeks, which is quite interesting. And the other things that they've done is, one, they've made the application process much easier. So it used to be about 20 pages long application, quite long delays. What they've done is it's almost like a 1-pager now. So that's much more streamlined. There is no need to wait. So there used to be like a cooling off period of up to 30 days. You can now apply almost immediately. And they've also extended it to not-for-profits, which weren't previously eligible, but now are eligible to it. Important aspects would be that you'd have to be 1 year in business in order to apply, and that you have to have at least 2 full-time employees in these work share units that they call them in order to apply for this program. So this one's kind of a program that's existed but has been modified to the current situation, making it more open, more available, and much more streamlined in order to be more accessible. The next program is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. So this is one probably we hear the most about, is the 75% wage subsidy. So this is a wage subsidy that applies for 3 months. So they're looking, it's funny because there's 2 here, wage subsidies, the dates are a little bit different, but at the end of the day, it's 3 months. It goes up to a benefit of $847 a week per employee. It is retroactive to the March 15th date. The one kind of element that's important about this one is that you have to be able to show a 30% reduction in revenues when comparing month to month this year to last year. So in that 3-month period, we'd be comparing, March 2019 to March 2020, and have to be able to show a 30% decline in revenue. This is one that is a little bit challenging for, companies that are in high growth, that are just starting up, because just the situation they're in, they've either invested in growing, the sales team and the products, and so the comparable will be difficult to make. But it is, if you're able to make that comparable, it is quite interesting. Obviously, 75% salary grant is an interesting amount in order to be able to keep your team. Important to know that if any employee is getting the personal wage subsidy, then they're not also eligible for this corporate wage subsidy. So that's something to know, because obviously if they're working, they shouldn't be getting the other one. The applications for this are not yet open, but they will be done through the CRA business account. So you'll have to apply online for that. Should be open shortly. So that's the 75% one. If you're not able to fit into that 30% reduction in revenues criteria, the 10% one that was previously announced is still available, and would be particularly available to companies that meet the small business deduction. And so this one, the way it works, it's 10% of salaries up to $13.75 per employee throughout this 3-month period, and up to $25,000 per employer. So meaning you could have about 18 employees running, up to 18 employees running on this program. So it's kind of a good fallback. If the 75% one doesn't fit, then this one could be one to look into. The nice thing about this too, there's no application. So the way it'll work, it's really that you'll pay the salaries as usual, and when you do your remittance, that's when you'll apply this wage subsidy to it, and really reduce it by 10% of the wages that you're able to get. So the process is a little bit more streamlined. You don't have to actually apply. It'll kind of be incorporated within the applications for remittance that you're doing. Lastly here, so the others were more so wage subsidies. It would be the interest-free loan that's been announced as well. So the Canada Emergency Business Account Program. So this is an interest-free loan that's also guaranteed by the government. This is one that you would go apply for with the banks, so the private institutions that are lending. It goes up to $40,000. You do also have to show that you're applying for it due to a reduction in your revenues in this period. But then what happens is if you're able to repay $30,000 of the $40,000 by December 2022, it is 25% forgivable. So $10,000 would almost be like a grant that you'd be able to keep. If not, you would then go into, I think different banks are offering different things, but I've seen 3-year term with different interest rates on the balance that's owed after that period. So this one, really the application would be through the financial institutions. What you do have to show as a business, it's available to small businesses and not-for-profits, and that you have a minimum of $50,000 up to a maximum of $1 million in payroll expenditures in order to be eligible. So these are kind of the main federal programs. There are others, and obviously there's also ones on as an individual or as a worker that we've been looking at that you could benefit from if you're one of the co-founders that's maybe not taking a salary, or that is, or as a freelancer. So different ones that you could look at if it makes sense more so on the individual side to also take advantage of. What we have put together, and that I invite you to go check out, is on Fundica. We have a series of infographics, and here they're quite small because it was hard to put into the presentation. And I didn't know which province we want to focus on here. So I invite you to go check it out, but it allows you to ask yourself a few questions. So what is it you're trying to do as a company? Are you trying to avoid layoffs? Are you trying to, maintain your workforce? So with those questions, you can kind of look into what program would you be eligible for? And depending on your industry as well, do that. So it's kind of a series of logical questions that allows you to see which programs, and then it actually links to the program, so it allows you to go check it out further. So I've put the link up here, but if you have any trouble accessing it or it's not something that's necessarily live on our website right now. We've been sharing it in different networks and hoping to help in that way. But if you're not able to find it, feel free to reach out to me, or I'll also share it with Kayla if she wants to pass it on, but it'll be in the presentation as well. So this is kind of a good one. We have it out for Quebec, Ontario, BC, and PEI right now in terms of provinces, and we're continuously updating this. So every time there's an announcement, it's being updated to reflect that. How much? Okay, I got a couple minutes here. It's my last slide, I think. So right on time, if it goes. Yes, okay, so as a kind of concluding overall of the presentation, I think in terms of best practices, what we've been trying to communicate and share here is that the kind of best practice is to move from government to banks to VCs, right? In order to really leverage the funds that you have to the maximum, in order to allow you to grow while leveraging non-dilutive and then going towards the dilutive funding. In going through kind of what is each funder looking for and why, I think, it's important to really understand and target the funder that you're going. So if you're talking to a bank, you need to understand what it is that they're looking for, what is the return that they're looking for, why are they interested in providing these funds, in order for you to have that conversation with them as well. Same thing with the VC. So with each different one, you have to keep in mind what is the framework within which they're also talking to you and interested in injecting those funds. I think, with the product market fit and the core team, all that comes together in a killer, application or pitch. If it's for a grant, sometimes you have to meet with the people in person as well, or you have to put together the application. That's what they're evaluating you on. So it's your pitch, your application. So important to highlight aspects of your team, the strengths of your team, the strengths of your product market fit, as well as how it really ties in with what they're looking for and what you're able to achieve. And at the end of the day, you're looking for a win-win relationship. So whether you're looking for government funding or you're working with a bank, it has to be a win-win on both sides, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Often we're so focused on, I want, to get more cash injected, but you have to make sure that it makes sense in the long term, that it's win-win on both sides. So that is the overall best practices. And I think we're almost right on time here.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much, Sahar. That was so unbelievably helpful. I really appreciate the level of detail with all of the different sort of funding avenues that can be pursued, but really going to Fundica and using that as your portal to access all of these different spaces. We've been partnering with Fundica for years, and we've received fantastic feedback from our network using this tool within their own businesses. So thank you for bringing this to life in today's webinar.
Thank you. Thank you. And if anybody has questions, my contact information as well on fundica.com. Feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to help.
Fantastic. And so today's webinar was completely recorded, so we'll have this up on our website up shortly this afternoon. I provided the link in the chat function. We will also have another session tomorrow as a part of the Women Entrepreneur Program that is focused on design thinking. So we'll really be outlining in partnership with Spring to Innovation how to design, think, and sort of pivot your business model during a COVID-19 sort of environment. So we'll be discussing that tomorrow, or I'm sorry, on Thursday. Apologies, from 12 to 1. As I mentioned, this will be recorded online. We also have a suite of other webinars that will be included across various topics, including funding, mentorship, design thinking, looking at supply chains, but focused on supporting women entrepreneurs during this challenging time. So thank you, Sahar, for bringing all of these insights to life, and have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.